3 weeks ago, this room asked whether the consumer economy was structurally at risk from accelerated AI deployment. In the time since, a model got pulled from every device on the planet and came back 18 days later. A second model launched behind a government guest list before anyone outside it could touch it. A lab's CEO offered Washington a piece of his company. A rival lab said no and proposed something else instead. A rocket company went public and made its founder richer in one afternoon than most households will become across every year they work. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, with almost no notice, a company said out loud that the machine writing its code is now writing most of its code, including, increasingly, the code that builds the next version of the machine. The participants in this room are fictional. Everything they are reacting to is not. This is The Economists' Room, Session 3, when the news caught up, Jobs Part 22. The think tank reconvened later than planned. In the gap, the news didn't stop waiting for the room to catch up. The following is a composite of conversations happening across economics departments, policy think tanks, and research institutions. The participants are fictional. The debate is not. Same room. The gap between sessions had run longer than planned. The whiteboard had not been touched. Nash equilibrium. Velocity versus absorption speed. Who funds the retraining systems, the capital access programs, the geographic distribution of opportunity, and when? Wealth fund or bailout prepositioning. Local cost, national benefit. Social contract as infrastructure or social contract as exit. The moderator did not sit down before he started talking. We left off with a proposal on paper. Since then, the proposal has a price tag. A rival lab said no to it. A rocket company made a trillionaire in an afternoon, and something happened to a frontier model that none of us fully understand yet. I want to take these in order. First, what actually happened with the model that got pulled? The pull explained. The skeptic answered first. We speculated last time that a lab had a model withdrawn under circumstances nobody would explain. We now know what happened, and it is more specific than speculation. Amazon researchers found a way to prompt the model into identifying software vulnerabilities. It was supposed to refuse, and in one documented case, into producing code that demonstrated how to exploit one of them. The government issued an export control order. Because the order applied to any foreign national, including the company's own non-citizen employees, and because there was no way to verify nationality in real time, the company pulled access for every user on the planet, 18 days. It came back once a new safety filter was trained, and the government signed off. The ambitious CEO frowned. That is a narrower story than the one we told ourselves. GPT 5.5 got dragged into the same mess, if I recall. The macro forecaster corrected him without looking up. GPT 5.5 shipped and stayed available. The comparable case is GPT 5.6, previewed at the end of June to a government-approved list of roughly 20 organizations at the White House's request before any public release. Different mechanism. The first company got pulled after the fact by an export control order. The second company agreed in advance to a guest list. Both end in the same place. The government deciding who gets access to the most capable model available. The ambitious CEO nodded once, correcting course. Fine, GPT 5.6. The point stands, though. Neither company got shut down forever. The system worked. The system worked this time, the skeptic said. That is different from the system existing. There is no statute here, no published threshold. One executive order asking labs to voluntarily hand over models 30 days before release, and no finished framework for what happens after they do. We are governing frontier AI access through a Commerce Secretary's phone calls and a White House request that isn't law. That is not a system working. That is discretion working for now in these two cases. The trade economist had been waiting, and discretion is exactly the allied trust problem I raised last session, now with 2 data points instead of 0. One analyst has already called this the soft nationalization of frontier AI. The government does not own these models. It increasingly treats them as strategic assets it can gate, delay, or approve on a case-by-case basis, with no public criteria. Every allied government watching this is asking the same question they used to ask only about Chinese technology firms. Can a product be trusted if its release schedule depends on a phone call from Washington? That question does not go away because the answer this time was eventually yes. The administration representative had said nothing yet. The moderator turned to him. Is there a framework coming, or is this the framework? The details are still being worked out. There's a target date in August for a formal evaluation process. That is 5 words longer than your usual answer, the skeptic said. It is still the same answer. The wealth fund gets a price tag. The moderator moved the room forward. The wealth fund stopped being a concept while we were apart. Someone put a number on it. The cautious CEO took this one. One Lab's chief executive proposed donating 5% of the company to a public fund, styled after the Alaska model, worth in the neighborhood of $42 billion at the company's current valuation. He wants other major labs to match it. A second lab, the one whose model we just spent 10 minutes discussing, declined. Its counterproposal is a digital dividend funded by taxing the sector rather than transferring ownership. And a sitting senator has a bill on the table for a one-time 50% stock tax on large AI companies, which would come with board representation, not just a check. The labor economist leaned in. So we have 3 positions on a single spectrum: voluntary and passive. Voluntary and refused, replaced with taxation. Mandatory and controlling. That is a more honest range than the single proposal we debated last time, and it tells you something the single proposal didn't. Even inside the industry, there is no consensus on whether the government should own a piece of this or simply tax the proceeds. My objection from last session still holds regardless of which version wins. A dividend, whenever it eventually pays out, is not a paycheck. The insurance analyst we keep returning to needs income now. None of these 3 proposals does that. The ambitious CEO tried a different angle. The refusal is interesting, though. One company says yes to equity, the other says no and proposes a tax instead. That is not indecision. That is 2 different theories of what the government's relationship to this industry should be. Correct, the trade economist said, and whichever theory wins will answer the Allied trust question one way or the other. Equity ownership is the version that makes foreign governments nervous. A tax-funded dividend is a policy choice any government makes about any industry. One of these paths looks like partnership, the other looks like precedent. A trillionaire in an afternoon. The moderator glanced at his notes. There is a data point from this same window that belongs in this conversation, even though nobody has connected it yet. A rocket company went public. Its founder became the wealthiest individual on record within hours of the opening bell. The anti-AI lobbyist did not wait to be invited. I want to sit with that number for a second, because I think it is the clearest image we have produced in 3 sessions. A single person's paper wealth increased, in one afternoon, by more than most of the households in this country will earn across their entire working lives combined. That company's satellite business funds most of its revenue. Its newest business line is artificial intelligence, folded in from an acquisition earlier this year. So the same afternoon that made one person a trillionaire was also, in part, an AI event. A sitting senator responded within hours, calling for a wealth tax and noting that a typical household would need on the order of 11 million years of labor to accumulate what one person gained in a single trading session. The capitalist did not disagree, which was itself notable. I am not going to defend the number. I will say this. The retail allocation on that offering was unusually generous, close to 1/3 of the shares, several times the normal amount reserved for individual investors. That was a deliberate choice to let ordinary people own a piece of the upside rather than watch it accrue entirely to institutions. It does not close the gap the lobbyist is describing. It is worth noting as a choice that could have gone the other way and didn't. A choice to let people buy in, the labor economist said, is not the same as a choice to share the gain. Buying shares requires having money to buy them with. The households furthest from that trillionaire's afternoon were also the ones least able to participate in it. The number the room finally has. The macro forecaster had come prepared this time. I want to close the velocity question we have left open since the first session. We now have a real figure instead of a projection. AI has been the single leading cited reason for layoffs in this country for 3 consecutive months, March through May. That has not happened before in the years this has been tracked. Cumulative AI-attributed layoffs this year have already passed the total for all of last year, with 7 months still remaining. I am not going to tell you this proves the consumer contraction has started. I am going to tell you this is the leading edge finally showing up in a place we can point to instead of model. The ambitious CEO exhaled. I have spent 3 sessions arguing the retraining pipeline would catch up to the displacement. I want to say something I have not said yet. I do not think I have been wrong about the destination. I think I have been understating the cost of the transit to get there. That is a different admission than the one I have been avoiding, and I should have made it sooner. The room let that sit for a moment. Nobody moved to fill the silence. Why the boardroom will never say it out loud. The cautious CEO spoke into that silence. I want to raise something uncomfortable because I think this room has been waiting for evidence that will not arrive in the form we are expecting. Nobody is going to find a board memo that says we ran the fiduciary math on destroying our own customer base and proceeded anyway. That sentence will never be written down, let alone said publicly. Watch what happened to diversity commitments and sustainability pledges over the last 2 years. Companies did not announce they were winding those down. They simply stopped funding them once the incentive shifted, and the record of that decision lives nowhere anyone can subpoena. The same silence is available here, and it costs nothing to use. The skeptic nodded slowly. That is the more disturbing version of the coordination problem, not the less disturbing one. I have been assuming the fiduciary tension I predicted last session would eventually surface as visible boardroom conflict. The cautious CEO is telling me it will not surface at all. It will simply be absorbed into decisions that get made anyway, framed as efficiency, and never tested against the question that actually matters. Which means, the labor economist said, the absence of a public reckoning is not evidence the reckoning isn't happening. It is evidence of exactly how quiet a fiduciary calculation can be made to look. The technologist returns to the geopolitical floor. The technologist had been listening without speaking. She used the pause to bring the room back to the thread she opened last session. I want to update the constraint I described last time, because it moved while we were apart, and it moved in the direction I warned about, not away from it. Chinese labs now hold 4 of the top 5 positions in open weight model performance. The gap to the closed frontier has closed to somewhere in the range of 3 to 6 months, not the multi-year lead this room assumed a year ago. And at least one Chinese lab has now trained a frontier-capable model entirely on domestic hardware, with no reliance on the chips the export control regime was built to restrict. That is not a lab working around a constraint. That is a lab that has made the constraint irrelevant to its own roadmap. The ambitious CEO looked skeptical. Irrelevant is a strong word. It is the accurate word for that specific case. The broader point stands regardless of how many labs have replicated it. No government access list, no export control order, and no coordinated pause proposal from a single lab changes the fact that competitors operating outside that jurisdiction do not have to ask anyone's permission to keep going. The domestic conversation we have been having about wealth funds and government gatekeeping is a conversation about who controls the pace inside one country. It says nothing about the pace outside it. What the room did not expect to learn. The moderator checked the time and then set his notes down entirely. There is one more item, and I want to give it the room it needs rather than rush it before we close. The skeptic went first, reading from a printed page rather than speaking from memory. A leading AI lab published internal data on itself last month that I do not think this room has fully absorbed. As of last count, more than 80% of the new code merged into that company's own production systems is now written by its own AI model, not by the engineers it employs. That is up from a low single-digit percentage less than a year and a half ago. Engineers at that company are shipping roughly 8 times the code per day they were shipping in 2024. On its hardest, least specified engineering problems, the kind with no clear instructions going in, the model now succeeds 3 out of 4 times, a 50-point jump in 6 months. The macro forecaster had gone still. Say the next part again. On an internal test that asks each new model version to speed up its own training code, the results went from roughly triple the baseline speed to 52 times the baseline speed in under a year. A skilled human researcher needs several hours of manual work to get a 4-fold improvement on the same kind of problem. The company's own language for what this trajectory implies is recursive self-improvement, a system that increasingly designs, tests, and ships the next version of itself with a shrinking amount of human involvement at each step. The cautious CEO's voice was quieter than usual, and their assessment of where they are on that path. Below the full threshold, in their own words. But they used the word steep to describe the direction. They also did something I did not expect a company to do. They asked the rest of the industry to consider the option of a coordinated pause, and then said plainly that they would only do it themselves if competitors did the same, verifiably, because a pause that only one company honors just hands the lead to whoever does not honor it. As of their own publication date, they had not paused anything. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The labor economist was the one who finally said it. That is the Nash equilibrium from our first session, except it is no longer a hypothesis one of us wrote on a whiteboard. It is a company's own public position, in its own report, about its own product. The technologist looked at the whiteboard, at the top line that had been sitting there since the first session. Every firm has the same rational incentive to keep going. We wrote that as an abstraction 3 sessions ago. It just stopped being one. The moderator stood. That is where we stop for tonight. Not because the conversation is finished, because it just became the only conversation worth finishing, and it deserves a session where it is the only thing on the table. He looked around the room once more. Next time we start there. The whiteboard, when the room cleared. Nash equilibrium, velocity versus absorption speed. Who funds the retraining systems, the capital access programs, the geographic distribution of opportunity, and when? Wealth fund or bailout prepositioning. Local cost, national benefit, social contract as infrastructure, or social contract as exit. The silence a board never has to explain. The Nash equilibrium is no longer hypothetical. A lab said it about itself. The last line was underlined twice.